November 7th, 1942, the White House, Washington, D.C. Franklin D. Roosevelt sat alone longer than usual that night. The cigarette holder tilted upward, smoke drifting toward the ceiling as rain pressed against the windows. Outside, Washington was quiet. Across the Atlantic, it would not be. On his desk lay the final cables, confirmation that American troops were already moving toward the shores of North Africa. Operation Torch was no longer a plan. It was motion. Steel hulls cutting through the Atlantic. Young men staring into darkness, unsure which coastline would appear at dawn. For nearly 3 years, Europe had been a continent Americans talked about but could not touch. France had fallen. Britain bled but stood. The Soviet Union burned from west to east. The United States, despite its factories and fury, had been separated by distance, protected and haunted by an ocean. Now that ocean was shrinking. Roosevelt understood the weight of this moment in deeply human terms. He was sending Americans not just into combat, but into history's most brutal theater. He leaned toward his aides earlier that evening and said quietly, almost to himself, that this was not merely an invasion, it was a declaration that the new world was finally stepping onto the old world's killing ground. In London, Winston Churchill waited for the same news, pacing, cigar clenched between his teeth. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler assumed wrongly that the Americans still lacked the nerve for a direct approach. In Moscow, Stalin watched and measured, wondering if this was real commitment or symbolic gesture. When Roosevelt finally rose from his chair, he knew one truth with absolute clarity. From this night forward, Europe was no longer unreachable, and every American leader would now have to choose their words carefully, because those words would decide how many would live to come home. November 8th, 1942, off the coast of Casablanca, French Morocco. Dawn arrived with gunfire. American landing craft heaved through. Rough surface tracer rounds stitched the water ahead of them. For the men aboard, this was their first glimpse of Europe's war. Confusing, chaotic, and terrifyingly close. For leaders in Washington, it was the moment their words were tested against reality. In the White House, Roosevelt received the first reports before breakfast. Resistance was heavier than expected. Vichy French forces were fighting back. The president listened in silence, then finally said what those around him would remember for years. So this is what it costs to arrive. There was no triumph. In his voice, only acceptance. Across the Atlantic, Prime Minister Churchill broadcast to the British people that same day. He chose his language with care. He did not call it victory. He called it the beginning of the return. Europe, he implied, was not being conquered. It was being reclaimed, inch by bloody inch. But behind closed doors, Allied leaders were more blunt. General George C. Marshall warned that if Torch failed, American credibility would collapse overnight. For months, U.S. soldiers had been accused by enemies and allies alike of hiding behind oceans. Now there would be no hiding. In Berlin, Hitler dismissed the landings as a sideshow. He told his generals that Americans lacked endurance. He believed the real battle remained in the East, against the Soviets. His misjudgment would echo through every decision that followed. Meanwhile, Roosevelt prepared to speak to the American public. He did not promise easy victory. Instead, he framed the landings as a moral crossing. America had not gone abroad to prove strength, but to stop a world from tearing itself apart. By nightfall, beachheads were secured. The cost was real, the consequences irreversible. Europe was no longer a distant map. It was a battlefield with American blood on its sand. January 14th, 1943, Casablanca Conference, Anfa Hotel, Morocco. The room was thick with smoke, tension, and ambition. Franklin Roosevelt arrived in a wheelchair, wrapped in a naval cloak, his expression calm but calculating. Winston Churchill followed, buoyant in tone but heavy with worry. For the first time in the war, American and British leaders met face to face on soil newly taken by American blood. Europe was no longer theoretical. It was now a destination with a cost. Behind closed doors, arguments fled. British commanders urged patience, Mediterranean advances, pressure on Italy. American generals wanted something bolder. France the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. The English Channel loomed in every conversation, even when no one named it. Roosevelt listened more than he spoke. Then, in a moment that stunned the room, he made his move. At the closing press conference, without consulting Churchill beforehand, he announced a policy that would shape the war's moral tone. Unconditional surrender. No negotiations, no deals, no escape for the Axis leadership. Churchill masked his surprise, but privately he worried. Such words, he feared, would harden German resistance and lengthen the war. Yet Roosevelt believed language mattered as much as armies. If America was now reachable to Europe, Europe needed to know America would not stop halfway. In Berlin, the declaration was seized upon by Nazi propaganda. Goebbels framed it as proof that the Allies sought Germany's destruction, not peace. In occupied Europe, resistance fighters heard something different, that liberation would not be bargained away. Stalin, watching from afar, remained suspicious. He still waited for the real test, a second front in France. Words were cheap, he believed. Blood was proof. As Roosevelt and Churchill departed Casablanca, one truth followed them. America had not only crossed oceans, it had crossed a line. The war would now end only one way. September 3rd, 1943, the White House, Washington, D.C. The message arrived just after midnight. Italy had surrendered. Franklin Roosevelt read the cable slowly, then set it down without a smile. Around him, aides waited for celebration. None came. Instead, the president spoke with measured caution. Italy's collapse, he warned, was not the end of anything. It was the opening of something far more dangerous. Across the Atlantic, American and British forces were already learning that lesson the hard way. The Italian peninsula had become a funnel of mountains, rivers, and ambushes. Germany moved swiftly, occupying the country and turning former allies into battlegrounds. Europe, now reachable, was proving unwilling to yield. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in the Mediterranean, sent a blunt assessment to Washington. This was no shortcut to Berlin. Every mile north would be paid for in lives. Roosevelt understood. He also understood the political pressure building at home. Americans wanted to know why. After Africa, after Sicily, after Italy's surrender, the war still seemed so far from ending. In a radio address days later, Roosevelt chose honesty over optimism. He told the nation that reaching Europe was only the beginning, that the enemy was strongest where it felt cornered. His words carried a quiet warning. Patience would be as vital as courage. In London, Churchill defended the Italian campaign as necessary, calling it the soft underbelly of the Axis. In Moscow, Stalin was unimpressed. He sent sharp messages demanding a true second front in France. Southern Europe, he argued, was a distraction. Roosevelt now stood between allies, pulling in opposite directions. His words to Stalin, to Churchill, to the American people became weapons of diplomacy. Europe was reachable, yes, but unity was fragile. And ahead, across the Channel, waited the decision that would define everything. June 4, 1944, the White House, Washington, D.C. Franklin Roosevelt's voice wavered as he rehearsed the prayer. Alone with a draft in his hand, the president crossed out words, rewrote phrases, then paused. Outside, spring sunlight fell softly on the Capitol, indifferent to the storm gathering over the English Channel. In less than 48 hours, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers would attempt what? Leaders had argued over for years the return to France. Europe was no longer just reachable, it was waiting. Roosevelt knew the invasion might fail. He knew the casualty estimates. He also knew that if American leaders spoke carelessly now, history would never forgive them. The speech he prepared was not for celebration. It was for grief, faith, and resolve. On June 6th, as dawn broke over Normandy, Roosevelt addressed the nation. He did not boast of American power. Instead, he asked citizens to pray for sons they would never see again, for courage under fire, for a future not yet earned. In that moment, leadership was not command, it was shared vulnerability. In London, Churchill waited for confirmation from the beaches, chain smoking as reports arrived in fragments. In Berlin, Hitler slept through the landings, convinced they were a diversion. By the time reality broke through, the foothold was already forming. American leaders spoke carefully that day. Eisenhower accepted full responsibility if the operation failed. Roosevelt avoided predictions. Even Churchill restrained his usual flourish. By nightfall, the beaches were held, but at a terrible cost. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, but Europe did not open its doors. It resisted violently. From this point forward, there would be no turning back. America had come ashore, and now it had to fight its way inward. December 16th, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Winter arrived with artillery. Before dawn, German guns shattered the silence of the Ardennes, slamming into thin American lines. Snow swallowed the roads. Radios crackled with disbelief. What was supposed to be a winding down war had exploded back into crisis. In Washington, Roosevelt received the news with a familiar stillness. The Germans had launched a massive counteroffensive, their last gamble. Some advisors feared public panic. The president rejected that instinct. He understood something essential. When Europe became reachable, American leadership had promised endurance, not speed. General Eisenhower's response was immediate and unyielding. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity, he told his commanders. The words were deliberate. Calm was now a weapon. On the ground, American soldiers froze, fought, and died holding crossroads with names few had heard before. Bastogne, Saint Vith, when the German demand for surrender reached the surrounded. 101st Airborne, the reply was a single word: nuts. It would become legend. But at the time, it was desperation sharpened into defiance. Roosevelt spoke to the nation days later, his voice steady despite his failing health. He framed the battle not as a setback, but as proof of enemy desperation. Europe, he reminded Americans, was fighting back, but so were they. In Berlin, Hitler believed this offensive might split the Allies and force negotiation. He misread American resolve. The very act of reaching Europe had transformed U.S. leadership psychology. Retreat was no longer acceptable. As Christmas passed under fire, the German advance slowed. Fuel ran out. Skies cleared. Allied air power returned. The gamble failed, but the cost ensured that when American leaders spoke of victory now, they did so without celebration, only grim certainty. April 12th, 1945, Warm Springs, Georgia. Franklin D. Roosevelt collapsed in his chair at the little White House. A portrait of George Washington unfinished on the easel before him. Within hours, the man who had guided the nation from isolation to invasion was dead. Across the Atlantic, artillery still thundered. Berlin was being encircled, but for American leaders, Europe suddenly felt farther away than it had in years. Harry S. Truman was sworn in that evening. He had been vice president for only 82 days. When advisors briefed him on the war's scope, he later said it felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. Europe was reachable. But now it demanded decisions from a man who had never expected to make them. Truman's first words to the cabinet were not triumphant. He asked one question: how did Roosevelt want this finished? The answer was clear: no wavering, no fragmentation of Allied resolve. The words spoken over years would now be tested one final time. In Europe, American generals watched the transition nervously. Continuity mattered, so Truman spoke deliberately to Stalin and Churchill, signaling stability. The war would continue exactly as planned. When Truman addressed the American people days later, he did not attempt to replace Roosevelt's voice. He promised only to carry it forward. In Berlin, Hitler was already retreating into his bunker. The end was coming, but the shape of the peace, what Europe would become once reachable in victory, was still undecided. And that question would soon fall squarely on Truman's shoulders. April 25, 1945, Torgau, Germany. The handshake was awkward, cautious, and historic. American and Soviet soldiers met at the Elbe River, their uniforms muddied by different roads to the same enemy. Cameras captured smiles, raised hands, shared cigarettes. In Washington, President Truman studied the photographs carefully. This was the image the world would remember: unity at the edge of victory. But behind the image, American leaders were choosing their words with surgical care. Truman understood that Europe was now reachable in a new sense, not by armies, but by influence. The Red Army controlled the East. American and British forces held the West. Where the lines stopped would shape generations. In his communications with Stalin, Truman remained firm but polite. He avoided celebration. He avoided threat. He spoke instead of cooperation of finishing the war, of honoring commitments made before Roosevelt's death. Every phrase was weighed. Missteps now could turn allies into adversaries overnight. Meanwhile, Eisenhower made a controversial decision. He halted Allied forces short of Berlin, honoring agreements with the Soviets. Some American commanders were furious. Berlin, they believed, was reachable. Why stop? Truman backed Eisenhower. He would not spend American lives for symbolic ground. In Berlin, the city collapsed inward. Hitler was days from suicide. German civilians flooded westward, chasing the sound of American artillery rather than Soviet guns. When Truman addressed the nation at the end of April, he spoke of victory as responsibility, not conquest. Europe had been reached. It had been broken, and soon it would have to be rebuilt. The war was ending, but the meaning of American presence in Europe was only beginning to take shape. May 7, 1945, Reims, France. The room was small. The moment was not. At 2:41 a.m., a German general signed the document that ended the war in Europe. No flags, no crowds, just tired men, harsh lighting, and the sound of pens scratching paper. When the news reached Washington, President Truman did not rush to the microphones. He waited. May 8 was Truman's 61st birthday. He refused celebration. Instead, he spoke to the American people with restraint, reminding them that victory had come at an unbearable cost. He asked that flags remain at half-staff in honor of Franklin Roosevelt. Even in triumph, American leadership chose humility. Across Europe, bells rang. In London, Churchill allowed himself rhetoric at last. In Paris, crowds filled the streets, but Truman's words were quieter. He framed the end of the European war not as an ending, but as a responsibility inherited. Privately, American leaders were already shifting their language. Germany was defeated, but Europe was shattered. Millions were displaced. Cities lay in ruins, and the alliance that had won the war was already fraying. Truman warned his cabinet that the United States could not simply go home. Europe was now reachable not because of ships and planes, but because America's absence would leave a vacuum others would fill. In Moscow, Stalin celebrated. In Washington, planning began. The war that had pulled America across the Atlantic was over. But the words spoken next about aid, occupation, and reconstruction would determine whether Europe rose as a partner or collapsed into another catastrophe. Victory Day closed one chapter. Another was already opening. June 5, 1947, Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. George C. Marshall stood at the podium beneath a calm spring sky, holding a speech that would redefine what it meant to reach Europe. There was no thunder in his voice, no triumph. He spoke plainly, almost cautiously, as if weighing each sentence against the wreckage of a continent. Europe, he said, was starving. Its industries were broken. Its political fabric was tearing. And if the United States did not act, chaos would finish what war had begun. President Truman had approved every word. This was the final evolution of American leadership language in World War II's aftermath. Not invasion, not surrender, not occupation, reconstruction. The Marshall Plan was not charity, it was strategy, shaped by experience. American leaders had learned that reaching Europe with armies was meaningless unless they stayed with ideas. Behind Marshall's calm delivery lay hard-earned lessons. The hunger of 1919 had fed extremism. The bitterness of punishment had invited revenge. This time, American leaders would speak in the language of stability, not vengeance. In Congress, there was resistance. Why rebuild former enemies? Truman answered with clarity, because abandonment would cost more than aid. Europe was now permanently within America's reach, economically, politically, morally. Across the Atlantic, the speech spread quickly. In bombed-out capitals, it sounded like hope. In Moscow, it sounded like a challenge. The war had ended 2 years earlier, But this was its true conclusion. When Europe became reachable, American leaders learned that power was not just the ability to arrive, but the wisdom to remain. And in that choice, the modern world was born.